The fluorescent lights of the newsroom at Clarin Digital hummed their familiar tune as Malena Quiroga scrolled through court documents on her laptop, her third cup of mate growing cold beside her keyboard. Buenos Aires stretched beyond the 10th floor windows, a sprawling testament to Argentina's complicated relationship with memory and justice. It was March 2015, and the city pulsed with the energy of a nation still learning how to reconcile its past with its present. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Avenida 9 de Julio, where traffic moved in its eternal dance of chaos and somehow functional order. Malena had been working this story for 3 months, following a corruption case involving construction contracts that everyone knew about, but no one seemed willing to truly investigate. The air in the newsroom was thick with cigarette smoke despite the ban, a small rebellion that the editors tolerated as long as the stories kept coming. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "Don't forget Thursday at the Plaza, 39 years this week." Malena didn't need the reminder. Every Thursday, her mother joined the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, the mothers and grandmothers who still marched for their disappeared children and grandchildren, their white headscarves a symbol of resistance that had outlasted the dictatorship itself. Elena Quiroga had lost her brother in 1978, taken from his apartment in San Telmo and never seen again. That loss had shaped Malena's childhood, filled with hushed conversations and the weight of unspoken grief that permeated their small apartment in Almagro like humidity before a storm. "Quiroga, you coming to the briefing?" Her editor, Roberto Paz, stood by the conference room door, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened in that perpetual state of editorial exhaustion. Roberto had survived 3 newspaper closures and the transition to digital with the adaptability of a Buenos Aires street cat. He understood the delicate balance between pushing boundaries and keeping the paper alive in a climate where advertising revenue depended on not angering the wrong people. The briefing was about the upcoming trial of Miguel Santoro, a businessman accused of embezzling funds meant for social housing in Villa Lugano. It was the kind of case that would generate headlines for a week before disappearing into the judicial labyrinth that swallowed most corruption cases in Argentina. Malena took her seat among the other reporters, noting how young most of them were, fresh from university and still believing that journalism was about truth rather than navigating the space between truth and survival. "The trial starts Monday," Roberto announced, distributing assignments. "Live coverage on the website, hourly updates on social media. Malena, your lead on this. I want context, history, the human angle. Make people care about another rich guy stealing from the poor." The cynicism in his voice was earned through decades of watching the powerful escape consequences, while the powerless filled the prisons of Devoto and Ezeiza. After the meeting, Malena walked to the Tribunales district, where the Palace of Justice stood like a grey monument to bureaucracy and delayed dreams. The building's neoclassical facade had witnessed countless promises of reform, each one dissolving into the porteño humidity. She had a meeting with Lucas Ferreira, a public defender who'd agreed to provide background on the judicial process. They met at a small café on Laval Street, where lawyers and court clerks gathered to discuss cases over cortados and media lunas, the sweet croissants disappearing as quickly as justice itself in the Argentine system. Lucas was 35, with the kind of exhausted idealism that marked public servants who hadn't yet surrendered to cynicism. His cheap suit showed the wear of countless court appearances, and his briefcase was held together with duct tape that he'd covered with stickers from various human rights organizations. "The Santoro case is theater," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with slow, deliberate movements. "Everyone knows he's guilty, but watch how the evidence gets questioned, how witnesses develop sudden memory problems, how procedural issues emerge like weeds after rain." "You sound defeated," Malena observed, recording their conversation on her phone while taking handwritten notes, a habit from journalism school she couldn't shake. "Not defeated, realistic," I defend people who steal food, who sell drugs to feed their kids, who occupy abandoned buildings because they have nowhere else to go. They get years in prison. Santoro stole millions, and he'll probably get house arrest in his mansion in Belgrano, if anything. Lucas pulled out a folder, sliding it across the small marble table. But here's what's interesting. Santoro's construction company had contracts dating back to the early 2000s. Some of those projects were on land that had interesting history. Malena opened the folder, finding photocopies of property records, newspaper clippings from the 1970s, and a list of names she didn't recognize. One address caught her attention. A lot in Floresta that had once housed a mechanic's workshop. According to a faded article from 1976, the workshop had been suspected of printing subversive materials. The owner, David Amstel, had disappeared along with 3 employees. The property had been sold in 1979 to a company that, through a series of transfers, eventually became part of Santoro's empire. "This is a different story," Malena said quietly, feeling the familiar pull of something deeper, something that connected the present corruption to the unhealed wounds of the past. "Every story in Argentina is a different story if you dig deep enough," Lucas replied. "The question is whether anyone wants to hear it." That evening, Malena returned to her apartment in Palermo, a small one-bedroom she could barely afford on a journalist's salary. The neighborhood had gentrified around her, the old pulperias replaced by craft beer bars and vegan restaurants that served to tourists and young professionals who spoke more English than Spanish. She spread the documents across her living room floor, mapping connections with colored string, like detectives in American crime shows. Though this was far more complex than any television narrative could capture. Her father called while she was working. Oscar Quiroga was a literature professor at UBA who had spent the dictatorship years keeping his head down, teaching Borges and Cortázar while friends disappeared around him. "Your mother says you're covering the Santoro trial," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he'd perfected over decades. "It's just a corruption case, Dad." "Nothing is just anything in this country, Malena. Be careful. Some stones are better left unturned." "Is that what you told yourself when Mom's brother disappeared?" The silence on the line stretched like the distance between their unresolved grief. "I told myself that staying alive to raise you was more important than dying for a principle. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed either. The world isn't divided into heroes and cowards, hija. Most of us live in the grey space between." After the call, Malena sat on her small balcony, watching the Buenos Aires night unfold below. The city never truly slept, just shifted into different rhythms of existence. Somewhere in the darkness were the answers to questions that had haunted families for decades. The Santoro trial was scheduled to begin in 5 days, but Malena was already seeing beyond the courtroom drama to something more complex, more dangerous, and more necessary than another story about corruption. She thought about Lucas's words, about whether anyone wanted to hear the truth. The real question, she realized, was whether she was brave enough to tell it, knowing that in Argentina the past was never really past, and every investigation was also an exhumation. The Santoro trial began on a humid Monday that had Buenos Aires suffocating under a blanket of thick air that promised an autumn storm, but refused to deliver. Malena arrived at the courthouse early, her press credentials hanging around her neck like a talisman against the bureaucratic obstacles she'd face. The metal detectors at the entrance beeped constantly as lawyers, journalists, and family members of various defendants shuffled through, each carrying their own burden of expectation or resignation. The courthouse lobby smelled of floor wax and disappointment, a combination that had seeped into the marble walls over decades of deferred justice. Judge Camila Ledesma presided over the case. A woman whose reputation for technical precision and emotional distance had earned her both respect and resentment within the judicial system. At 48, she had risen through the ranks with a combination of brilliance and strategic silence, never quite aligning with any political faction, but never opposing them either. Malena had researched her extensively, finding a career marked by safe decisions and careful navigation of the political currents that determined judicial appointments in Argentina. The courtroom was packed, with television cameras positioned to capture every moment for the live broadcasts that had become standard for high-profile corruption cases. Malena found a seat in the press section, noticing how Santoro's legal team occupied an entire row, their expensive suits and confident postures a stark contrast to the overwhelmed public prosecutors who would argue for the state. Miguel Santoro himself sat with the practiced calm of someone who had been through this before, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression conveying mild inconvenience rather than concern. As the proceedings began, Malena's phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "Check your email. Documents you need to see. A friend of David Amstel." Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to focus on Judge Ledesma's opening statements, delivered in a monotone that somehow made the gravity of embezzling funds meant for social housing sound like a traffic violation. The judge's eyes never lingered on any one person, scanning the courtroom with the mechanical precision of a security camera. During the first recess, Malena rushed to a quiet corner and opened her email on her phone. The message contained attachments, scanned documents from the 1970s, including police reports, property seizure orders, and a list of names labeled Operation Cleanup, Floresta Sector. David Amstel's name was there, along with notations that made Malena's stomach turn. Transferred to mechanical school, the euphemism for the Navy Mechanics School, ESME, the most notorious detention center of the dictatorship. Below his name, in different handwriting, property cleared for redistribution. She called Lucas immediately. "Can you meet me? I have something." They met at a pizzeria on Corrientes Avenue, far enough from the courthouse to avoid colleagues, but close enough to return for the afternoon session. The restaurant was one of those Buenos Aires institutions that hadn't changed since the 1960s, with wooden booths scarred by decades of carved initials and conversations that ranged from football to philosophy. Lucas examined the documents while eating a slice of fugazeta, the cheese and onion pizza that was his lunch most days when trials ran long. "This is dangerous territory," he said quietly, wiping his hands on a paper napkin. "Connecting current corruption to dictatorship-era property seizures opens wounds that powerful people want to keep closed. But it's the truth. Santoro's empire is built on stolen land, stolen from people who were murdered by the state. Truth and justice aren't the same thing in Argentina, Malena. Sometimes revealing one makes the other impossible." Lucas looked around the restaurant, a habit developed from years of understanding that privacy was an illusion in Buenos Aires. "There's someone you should meet. Camila Ledesma's former clerk, who quit suddenly 2 years ago. She might talk to you, but not on record." The afternoon session of the trial proceeded with the predictable rhythm of procedure and objection. Malena watched Judge Ledesma more carefully now, noticing the slight tension in her jaw when certain evidence was presented, the way her fingers drummed silently on the bench when the prosecution fumbled their arguments. During a break in testimony, Santoro's lead attorney approached the bench for a sidebar, and Malena saw something pass between him and the judge, a recognition that went beyond professional courtesy. That evening, Malena met the former clerk, Patricia Vega, at a cafe in San Telmo, where tango music drifted from the nearby Plaza Dorrego, and tourists photographed the crumbling facades that locals walked past without seeing. Patricia was nervous, constantly checking her phone and watching the door. She had the hollow look of someone who had traded idealism for survival, a common transformation in those who got too close to the machinery of Argentine justice. "Ledesma is brilliant," Patricia began, speaking quickly as if afraid she'd lose her nerve. "But she's also trapped. Her appointment to the bench in 2008 came with conditions. There are cases she can't touch, connections she can't make. The Santoro case is supposed to be simple corruption, nothing more. But it's not simple. The properties involved have history from the dictatorship. Patricia nodded, pulling out a cigarette with shaking hands, though smoking had been banned in cafes for years. The waiter said nothing, understanding that some conversations required the comfort of familiar vices. 2 years ago, a similar pattern emerged in another case, construction fraud that traced back to seized properties. Ledesma was pressured to limit the scope of investigation. When she resisted, things happened. Her daughter's university admission was suddenly reviewed. Her husband's import business faced unexpected audits. She got the message. So she compromised. We all compromise. The question is where you draw the line. Ledesma drew hers at keeping her family safe while maintaining the appearance of judicial independence. But it's eating her alive. I've seen her reviewing old cases late at night, cases from the early 2000s, when she was a young judge who still believed she could change things. Malena walked home through the cobblestone streets of San Telmo, past antique shops and closed restaurants, the city's history literally beneath her feet in the old stones that had witnessed everything from colonial rule to military coups to the current democracy that felt increasingly fragile. Her mother called as she reached the weekly antiques market in Plaza Dorrego, now empty except for a few vendors packing up their remaining merchandise. "Are you coming Thursday?" Elena asked, and Malena could hear the television in the background. The evening news recycling the same stories of corruption and violence that had become the white noise of Argentine life. "I'm working on something important, Mom. More important than memory, than bearing witness. It's connected. The corruption cases today, they're built on the crimes of yesterday. The properties stolen during the dictatorship are being traded and developed by the same networks that protected the killers." There was a long pause. Then Elena said, "Your uncle would have pursued this story. He believed journalism could change things. Just remember, Mija, that believing got him killed." Back in her apartment, Malena spread out the new documents alongside her earlier research. The pattern was clear. Properties seized from disappeared persons in the 1970s had been sold through shell companies, eventually consolidated into development projects that generated millions in government contracts. Santoro was just one player in a larger system that converted blood into concrete and glass. She began writing, not the article for tomorrow's paper about the trial's daily proceedings, but a deeper investigation that connected 4 decades of Argentine history. At 2 in the morning, another email arrived. This time it contained photographs. Judge Ledesma at a private gathering in 2008, standing next to military officers who had been accused but never convicted of human rights violations. Another showed her signing documents at a law firm that had defended corporate interests during the privatization waves of the 1990s. The sender remained anonymous, but the message was clear. Everyone in this story had compromises in their past, decisions that looked defensible at the time but cast long shadows in the light of history. The revelation came on a Wednesday morning that started with unusual clarity, one of those rare Buenos Aires days when the pollution lifted and you could see all the way to the Rio de la Plata from the high floors of downtown buildings. Malena had spent the night in the newspaper's archives, both physical and digital, piecing together property records, court documents, and newspaper clippings that spanned 40 years. The security guard had brought her coffee twice, understanding without asking that some stories demanded nocturnal dedication. Roberto had given her unofficial permission to pursue the deeper angle, though he'd been careful to phrase it as background research, rather than an investigation that might attract the wrong kind of attention. The breakthrough wasn't dramatic, just a single line in a 1982 property transfer document that listed a witness, C. Ledesma, notary public. Camila Ledesma had been 22 then, fresh from law school, working at a firm that specialized in property transfers during the last years of the dictatorship. The firm, Mendoza and Associates, had processed dozens of properties seized from disappeared persons, providing the legal veneer that transformed state terrorism into real estate transactions. Malena cross-referenced the dates and names, finding that young Camilla had notarized at least 15 transfers of properties whose owners had been detained at Esma. She called Lucas at dawn, knowing he'd be awake preparing for court. "I need to see you." "Not at the courthouse." They met at the Recoleta Cemetery, among the elaborate mausoleums of Argentina's elite dead, where even the most sophisticated surveillance would struggle among the marble angels and carved sorrow. The morning fog clung to the pathways between the tombs, creating an atmosphere that felt appropriate for discussing the intersection of past and present crimes. They walked slowly past Evita's grave, where fresh flowers always appeared despite the decades since her death, a reminder that in Argentina, the dead often wielded more influence than the living. Ledesma was part of it, Malena said, showing him the documents on her tablet. The screen brightness turned low as if the information itself needed to be whispered. She might not have known what she was signing, but she gave legal legitimacy to theft and murder. Lucas studied the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood how law could be twisted to serve power. She was young, probably following orders. The question is what she's done since then. Has she been trying to atone, or has she been protecting the system that elevated her? Both, maybe. Patricia said she reviews old cases, seems tormented by something. Guilt is a luxury in Argentina. Most people can't afford it. Lucas stopped at a tomb decorated with fresh flowers, reading the inscription of a family wiped out by the 1955 bombing of Plaza de Mayo. If you publish this, it destroys her career, maybe sends her to prison. But it also disrupts every case she's overseen for 15 years. Appeals, retrials, chaos in a system that's already barely functioning. So we say nothing. Let Santoro walk free with a slap on the wrist while living on land stolen from the disappeared. I'm not saying that. I'm saying be strategic. Information is power only if you use it correctly. That afternoon, Malena attended the trial with new eyes, watching Judge Ledesma's controlled performance from the bench. The prosecution was presenting evidence of embezzlement, spreadsheets and bank records that drew clear lines between government funds and Santoro's personal accounts. But they carefully avoided any mention of the property's origins, focusing only on the contemporary corruption. Santoro's lawyers, led by the formidable Eduardo Ramirez, picked apart the evidence with surgical precision, finding inconsistencies that they magnified into reasonable doubt. During a recess, Malena noticed Ledesma in the hallway, standing alone by a window that overlooked the city. The judge's reflection in the glass showed a face stripped of its courtroom composure, revealing exhaustion and something that might have been despair. Malena approached slowly, her press badge visible, but her recorder hidden. "Judge Ledesma, could I ask you about the trial's timeline?" Ledesma turned, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Ms. Quiroga, isn't it? You've been covering this case with unusual dedication." "It's an important case. Construction corruption affects thousands of families waiting for housing." "Yes, the contemporary victims. We must always remember the contemporary victims." There was something in the way she emphasized contemporary that made Malena's pulse quicken. "As opposed to historical victims." Ledesma's eyes sharpened, and for a moment Malena saw the intelligence that had propelled her through the judicial ranks. "In my experience, Ms. Quiroga, journalists who dig too deep sometimes find themselves buried in their own discoveries. The past has a way of collapsing on those who disturb it carelessly." "Is that a threat?" "It's an observation from someone who has spent 20 years watching idealists destroy themselves against the machinery of compromise that keeps this country functioning. What you think is courage might just be naivety with a death wish." Before Malena could respond, Ledesma walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor with metronomic precision. But she'd left something behind on the windowsill, a folded piece of paper that looked accidentally abandoned. Malena picked it up, finding an address in Floresta and a time, 10 p.m., come alone. The address led to a small park near the old mechanics workshop that had belonged to David Amstel. By 10 o'clock, the area was deserted except for a few homeless people sleeping on benches and cats hunting in the shadows. Ledesma arrived precisely on time, dressed in civilian clothes that made her look younger, more vulnerable. She sat on a bench under a broken streetlight, the darkness providing cover for a conversation that couldn't happen in daylight. "I know what you found," Ledesma began without preamble. "The property transfers, my signature on documents that legitimized murder. I was 22, working 16-hour days at a firm that promised a future in law. They said the owners had abandoned the properties, fled the country. I wanted to believe it." "When did you learn the truth? Officially? During the trials of the juntas in 1985? Personally? I think I always knew. You don't work in law during a dictatorship without understanding that legal and legitimate are different concepts." Ledesma pulled out a cigarette, her hands steady despite the weight of confession. "I've spent 30 years trying to balance the scales, but justice isn't mathematics. You can't equation your way to redemption. Why are you telling me this?" "Because the Santoro case is bigger than one corrupt businessman. There's a network that has operated since the dictatorship, transforming political violence into economic power. Santoro is a node, but cutting him out won't stop the system. However, there's evidence hidden in the trial documents coded in the financial records. Property identification numbers that trace back to disappearances. Bank accounts that connect to military officials who were never prosecuted." Malena realized what Ledesma was offering. Not an interview or a confession, but a map. "You're using the trial to expose the network." "I'm trying, but there are limits to what a judge can do from the bench without destroying the very authority that makes judgment possible. You, however, are not bound by the same constraints. You want me to publish what you can't say in court. I want someone to tell the truth before I become too complicit to recognize it anymore, but understand the cost. The people involved have killed for less than what you're investigating. They have judges, politicians, journalists on their payroll. Once you publish, there's no hiding behind press credentials or public attention." Ledesma stood to leave, then turned back. "Your mother marches every Thursday at the plaza." "My mother stands at her window every Thursday, watching them pass, too ashamed to join because she survived by staying silent. We're all children of the same trauma, Ms. Quiroga. The only choice is whether we perpetuate it or expose it, knowing that exposure might destroy us too." After Ledesma left, Malena sat alone in the park, listening to the city's night sounds. Sirens, dogs barking, the distant music from a cumbia party that would last until dawn. She thought about her uncle, disappeared before she was born, existing now only in her mother's stories and a faded photograph on their apartment wall. She thought about Lucas, defending the poor while the rich bought justice. She thought about Patricia, who'd fled rather than compromise further. And she thought about Ledesma, carrying 30 years of guilt while trying to thread the needle between complicity and revelation. The story broke on a Thursday morning, deliberately timed to coincide with the Madres' weekly march at Plaza de Mayo. Malena had worked with Roberto to ensure maximum impact, a front-page investigation in the print edition, a multimedia presentation online featuring documents, timelines, and interactive maps showing the transformation of seized properties into contemporary developments. The headline read, "The Architecture of Impunity, How Dictatorship-Era Property Seizures Built Today's Corruption Networks." Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times, triggering a cascade of responses that ranged from public outrage to private threats. Malena watched the reaction from the newsroom, surrounded by colleagues who looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Roberto had assigned security to her after the first death threat arrived at 7 a.m., a carefully worded message that mentioned her daily routes and her mother's address. The second floor of the Clarín building had become her temporary refuge, with a cot in the break room and delivered meals that she barely touched. The adrenaline of publication was wearing off, replaced by the cold reality of what she'd set in motion. The Santoro trial continued, but the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed dramatically. Protesters gathered outside, holding photographs of disappeared relatives and signs connecting contemporary corruption to historical violence. Inside, Judge Ledesma maintained her composure, though Malena noticed the increased security around the bench and the way the judge's eyes now swept the gallery with genuine wariness. Santoro's legal team had filed for a mistrial, claiming prejudicial media coverage, but Ledesma denied the motion with a lengthy statement about the public's right to information and the independence of judicial proceedings. Lucas called her from the courthouse. "Santoro's people are scrambling. They're trying to shift focus to you, claiming you're politically motivated, that you're connected to radical groups. They've hired a PR firm to destroy your credibility. Let them try. The documents speak for themselves. Documents don't protect you from a bullet, Malena. You need to be careful." That afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at the newspaper. Camila Ledesma's daughter, Sofia, a 25-year-old graduate student who'd driven from La Plata after reading the article. Roberto brought her to a conference room where Malena was reviewing follow-up materials, and the young woman's resemblance to her mother was striking, though her eyes held an openness that Camilla had long since shuttered. "My mother doesn't know I'm here," Sofia began, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. "But I needed to thank you. She's been carrying this guilt my entire life, and it's poisoned everything. Maybe now she can finally face it instead of letting it eat her from inside. Your mother is trying to do the right thing, within the constraints she faces. Constraints she created for herself. We all have choices, Ms. Quiroga. My mother chose career over conscience for 30 years. Maybe your article will force her to finally choose differently." That evening, as Malena prepared for another night in the newsroom, her phone rang with a call from her father. Oscar's voice was strained, and she could hear her mother crying in the background. "They came to the apartment," he said. "3 men in suits, very polite, very clear. They said you should reconsider your recent publications. Think about your family's well-being. Are you and Mom okay?" "We're fine. Your mother told them to go to hell, threw her white headscarf at them, and said she'd survived one dictatorship and wasn't afraid of their corporate version. But Malena, these aren't empty threats. They know where we live, where we work, our routines. I can't stop now, Dad. Not when we're this close to exposing the whole network. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking you to be smarter than your uncle was. He thought courage alone was enough. It wasn't." The next day brought unexpected support from within the judicial system. 3 retired judges published a joint statement supporting the investigation and calling for a comprehensive review of property transfers from the dictatorship period. Human rights organizations that had been fighting these battles for decades suddenly found their voices amplified by mainstream media attention. The Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo announced they had evidence connecting some of the seized properties to pregnant women who had been disappeared, their babies given to military families while their mothers' assets were redistributed. Judge Ledesma made a dramatic decision in court that afternoon. She expanded the scope of the Santoro trial to include investigation of the historical property claims, arguing that the corruption charges couldn't be properly adjudicated without understanding the full context of the assets involved. Santoro's lawyers immediately appealed, but the appellate court, perhaps sensing the shift in public opinion, declined to intervene. Malena interviewed Lucas at a cafe near the courthouse, this time openly, with cameras present. He spoke carefully but forcefully about the 2-tier justice system that had persisted through democratic transitions. "We prosecute the poor for stealing bread while allowing the rich to inherit fortunes built on blood," he said, his exhausted idealism finally finding public expression. This isn't about revenge or reopening old wounds. It's about acknowledging that wounds don't heal when they're covered with concrete and shopping malls. The government's response was swift and contradictory. The president expressed support for judicial independence while warning against politicizing criminal proceedings. The Ministry of Justice announced a task force to investigate historical property transfers, but staffed it with officials known for their ability to bury investigations in bureaucracy. The opposition called for immediate action while carefully avoiding commitment to specific measures that might alienate their own supporters with ties to questionable fortunes. On the 7th day after publication, as the story dominated news cycles and dinner conversations across Argentina, Malena received a call from an unknown number. The voice was old, weathered by age and cigarettes, but clear in its purpose. "I was at ESMA," the man said. "I survived because I collaborated, gave them information that got others killed. I've lived with that shame for 40 years. But I kept records, documents they thought were destroyed. Names, dates, properties, the whole system. I'm dying now, cancer, a few weeks at most. I want to give testimony before I go, but only to you." The meeting was arranged for that night at a hospice in Vicente Lopez, where the man, Carlos Mendez, lay connected to machines that marked his remaining time in beeps and drips. His testimony, recorded over 3 hours, provided the missing links that connected military officials, civilian collaborators, and contemporary businessmen in a web of complicity that spanned generations. He named judges who had knowingly legitimized seizures, bankers who had laundered the proceeds, and politicians who had ensured the statute of limitations protected everyone involved. "I don't expect forgiveness," Carlos said as the recording ended. "I just want the truth documented before everyone who knows it is dead." The final chapter of the immediate story came with Judge Ledesma's verdict in the Santoro trial. Standing in a packed courtroom, with cameras broadcasting live to a nation watching history being written, she delivered a 60-page decision that went far beyond the corruption charges. She found Santoro guilty, but used the judgment to establish legal precedent for investigating the historical origins of contested properties. More dramatically, she announced her own recusal from future cases pending an investigation into her role in the 1982 transfers, effectively ending her judicial career, but perhaps beginning her redemption. As Ledesma left the courthouse for the last time as a judge, she stopped where Malena stood among the press corps. "You asked if my warning was a threat," she said quietly. "It was a recognition. We threaten ourselves every time we choose silence over truth. Thank you for forcing me to finally make the right choice." The aftermath would play out over months and years. Investigations, trials, appeals, and the slow grinding of justice that moved like tectonic plates in Argentina. Some properties would be returned to families of the disappeared. Others would remain tangled in legal disputes that outlived the claimants. Santoro would appeal, perhaps successfully, and new corruption would undoubtedly emerge to replace what had been exposed. But on that Thursday evening, as Malena stood in Plaza de Mayo with her mother and the other families of the disappeared, she felt something shift in the air. The white headscarves moved in their eternal circle around the pyramid. But now, they were joined by young people who hadn't lived through the dictatorship, but understood that its shadows still shaped their present. The truth hadn't emerged as a dramatic revelation, but as a steady accumulation of evidence, testimony, and courage that eventually became impossible to ignore. Oscar stood at the edge of the plaza, having overcome his fear to join his wife and daughter in public remembrance. "Your uncle would be proud," he told Malena, and for the first time she heard no qualification in his voice, no warning about the price of truth. The story would continue, as all stories in Argentina did, without clear resolution, but with the stubborn insistence that memory matters, that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to let the past disappear into comfortable silence. Malena had learned that truth emerges not as headline, but as process, not as explosion, but as excavation. One document at a time, one testimony at a time, one decision at a time to choose revelation over concealment. As the Madres completed their march, and the plaza emptied into the Buenos Aires night, Malena understood that she had not uncovered the truth so much as contributed to its slow emergence from decades of deliberate burial. The work would continue tomorrow and the day after, and for as long as it took for Argentina to fully face the architecture of impunity that supported its present. She had played her part, and others would play theirs, in the endless task of making history visible despite all efforts to keep it hidden.